Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk about creating the kinds of always changing, wonderfully messy cities and towns that we humans clearly love. We'll talk with those people trying to revive them or create them anew, whether they be designers, developers, builders, planners, or just anyone interested in the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. Have my friend and colleague Eric Kronberg here with me today from Atlanta, Georgia. Eric and I actually had the opportunity to meet when I was also living in Georgia, and interesting guy that has done so much work in the field of missing middle, small scale development that I've really been meaning to get him on here for a long time. So I think we're gonna probably be all over the map today. Eric is like a content producing machine, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Eric, thanks so much for joining, man.
Kevin, so excited to be here, man. Let's dive in wherever you want to start.
All right. Well, I do want to have a little bit of background, make sure people know who you are. Were you actually from Georgia originally?
No, okay, great question. So I was born in Detroit, and my dad moved us to the cornfields of Ohio when I was 1 year old. And I was like, man, Detroit was a pretty cool city, Dad. Why did we leave? But that growing up and surrounded by corn, like just fostered this desire to live in a city. Like I really wanted to get out. Uh, Made sure for college I applied nowhere in the Midwest. I'm like, I'm getting out of here. And I went to Tulane School of Architecture in New Orleans, which was
Cool.
brilliant, amazing, wonderful, great teachers, great urbanism, just learned so much, but also knew when I graduated that if I stayed in New Orleans, I'd probably have an amazing, wonderful life and be dead at 40. So, so I was like, I need a plan B. And a lot of friends were moving to Atlanta, which was, kind of the mecca of the South, opportunity, parties, food, music stuff. And so I came up and crashed on couches for a summer, had an amazing time. And when it came time to take a job, I totally made this horrible decision and took a job in Naples, Florida, doing, beachfront homes for really, really, really wealthy people because my father and my younger brother were down there. I'm like, oh, my dad, family, and down there for about 2 or 3 weeks. It's like, what the hell did I do? This is a bad choice. I stuck it out for a year and came back to Atlanta. I was like, and I was so traumatized by my Florida experience that I took the first job I found in Atlanta, and it was basically doing office warehouse, which is also like not not the best of choices. But
That's like not what you went to Tulane for, right?
no, what you're dealing for. I was like, I've been to Atlanta, I don't care, I'll take it. Look at me here. But there's also this bizarre kind of atonement or passion for new urbanism. And so the principal of the firm, a small firm, was doing kind of pro bono work on master planning around new urbanism. So this was 98, and so I was reading a lot of the stuff being put out by Dwani and other folks, and I thought it was a big crock. I was like, this is just a nice way to dress up greenfield. Like, I want to do urban infill. I've got to find a better path than what I'm doing now if my life gets serious. So I really kind of knuckled down and was really finally intentional for my third job to find a firm that was doing urban infill, helping fix cities, do the things I wanted to do. And that firm was called Brock Green. It was Eric Brock and David Green. And Dave Green is a mentor. He's amazing. He went on to Perkins and Will and helped run their urban design studio, kind of, I think, corporate wide, for many, many years after I worked with him. And he just moved to Arup. And so I've catch him at CNU every now and then. But, Dave's the kind of guy you bring in to design entire cities in the Middle East, right? Or other like really high level things. But Elizabeth Ward Williams in our office, our head urban design, she worked under David. Her husband worked under David. So in terms of a guy in Atlanta that's had a huge influence on urbanists and design, Dave's been like a through line for a lot of us. So so basically worked with David and Eric Brock for a couple years, and then in the recession post 9/11, I was young, didn't understand how recessions work. But I'm like, well, I was working on these cool projects. Now I'm working on kind of lame, apartment retrofits. This is not fun. And I had a chance to buy a crazy old farmhouse that was a boarding house in Atlanta. And I was like, I'm going to do some development. And so bought the house. Um, my dad's restaurateur, very hands on to the point that he was bored. He had bought a winery up on Lake Erie in Ohio
Hmm.
that was losing insane amounts of money, but it felt like it was a good project for him. And so he was doing some demo. He's not in shape, doesn't take care of himself, but he was demoing a walk-in cooler by standing on the top of it. Right? That's not an effective way. I mean, it's very
Right.
effective.
It's effective. Yeah.
It's effective. It's not safe. Very effective. And so he fell through the roof of it and broke one arm and his other thumb, and he still like 4 months to get open. So that was my call to quit working for a real firm. I was renovating his old flop house and helping him kind of like 5 days on, 5 days off at each gig. And it took a good 9 months for us to be ready to strangle each other. And I was like, all right, got through, you're open, got through the major challenges. You want to kill me, I want to kill you. I'm going to go do my own thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good time to pivot to something else. And that's convinced a buddy to start Cronenberg Wall. And that was late 03, really hitting the boards and drawing stuff in 04. And so a long run of learning and testing along the way.
That's really cool. So, I mean, we're going to get into the meat of some of this in a little bit, but I'm always curious about, people who start their own companies. And I've certainly observed with you, you got a pretty strong entrepreneurial streak. And where do you think did that come from your dad? Where do you think that came from?
Yeah, definitely. Growing up with if your peers or parents are entrepreneurial and doing their own thing, like you get that as an ethos without a doubt. But also part of something I glossed over in my backstory. This is my wife will want me to say this is I went to Culver Military Academy, which is a
Hmm.
really great prep school in central Indiana, and this was for high school with the expressed desire to be an escape path from the Midwest. And they teach you leadership, they teach you a lot of things. I hated the military aspects, but I was like, I want to get out of Dodge, and it just instilled like the ability to lead, to think critically, to problem solve. And so having that as a high school experience is something a lot of kids don't get, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'd be remiss not to give them a shout out, because it's one of those things where I went to Tulane to find the polar opposite experience, which was an amazing yin and yang, but had the ability to stay sane and passing grades and everything else at Tulane because I'd had that background and training in high school.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. It's amazing how many people I run across that went to Tulane for architecture school.
I mean, it's really amazing. The challenge we have here in Atlanta, because we have a lot of high school kids that we talk to, they're trying to figure out their passion, and they get really bummed because Georgia Tech also has a really strong
Yeah.
program,
Yeah.
and it's so affordable. And you have all these kids that want to leave Atlanta, experience the world, and go somewhere else. And I'm like, I hear you, but do you want to pay like 5x or 10x to get an equal or lesser education, or maybe the same education as Tech? And so
Yeah.
Tulane I needed that. I needed to go somewhere else. And it was amazing all the way through. Tech right now is doing great stuff as well here in Atlanta.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great school. So, I think one thing that I want to preface a little bit for people who aren't familiar with you and your firm's work, uh, you cover a lot of ground. You talk, I think it's fair to say that a lot of your passion revolves around urban infill and sort of small and middle scale urban infill. Uh, for anybody who hasn't seen like your website or your blog, I'd recommend it to for any number of reasons. The content's great, but one thing that you all have done is you really graphically represent your ideas really, really well. It's obvious you spend a ton of time thinking about how to graphically depict the various scenarios that you write about. Do you want to talk about that? Because we all talk about the ideas, but the communication aspect of and how do you communicate that to lay people is so important.
Yeah, so we get an opportunity to present a lot, and we appreciate it to share ideas and discuss, and it gives us a chance to really hone and test what works and what resonates and what doesn't. And honestly, like there's several of us. Elizabeth leads most of the presentation work. Katie helps her with graphics. It's my job to kind of stand over their shoulder and just complain about things. But we Elizabeth and I can write. I write okay, not well. My wife's a recovering English PhD, so like in
Hmm.
comparison, I can barely type. But presentations like leverage and graphics, like that's just our strong suit, right? And it's easy for us to think about these things and convey things graphically. And so um, presentation decks are just a natural form of expression for I think all three of us together. And we're always trying to see what resonates. Like how do you motivate action? How do you get to outcomes? And so we've been doing it a long time. And one of the things we've been doing is when you're talking about urbanism, we're thinking about things from Joe Minicozy and Urban Three, all his stuff, and Chuck and Strong Towns, all these different factors we're trying to lace together, but showing our buildings to scale on a block to show how things really fit. We just try to add this level of realism. Then in our blog, you'll see that, we've done several posts of just running through the math, right? I do
Yeah.
some of my own development. We have access to math. We have real numbers. We're building, getting feedback from contractors for ourselves and clients. It's like, we want to ground everything we do in real math, right? We're not trying to blow smoke. We want this to work. And part of what's been really this is just back to incremental development alliance, which I'm sure we'll cover more, is got pulled in early by Jim Cooman and John Anderson to help with that. And it was really frustrating to be helping and teaching and realizing, like in Syracuse and Memphis, all these great cities, that none of the stuff we had was cost effective, or there was no cost effective path for somebody from Memphis to hire us for bespoke architecture. So that really bugged us. And we spent a lot of time over the past 6 years working on solutions for that.
Yeah. Well, I should talk more about that. What are some of the issues? You know, there's obviously any number of like zoning and other process issues, but in terms of somebody who's just wanting to do small scale projects from the standpoint of an architect who, like yourself, who has done it, you continue to try to do it. What are some of the issues from just going out and hiring an architect to help you out?
Yeah, so I'll use this story that we went through. One of the another shout out is we've been able to work in Chattanooga for really consistently for the past 7 years, and that's really thanks to the great leadership and support of Lyndhurst Foundation and Macon
Hmm.
Toledano specifically. Lyndhurst has been, and Benwood Foundation as well in partnership. It's not all Lyndhurst, but the two of them working together have been really committed to the urbanism of Chattanooga, to attainable housing, to just better urban outcomes for the whole city. And we've tested and tried various ways to help them deliver missing middle housing in other ways. And one of the earliest things we did is we did some basic schematic design for like a local firm to finish up. Did that work? No, that actually didn't go well at all, right?
Hmm.
Like this, it was really frustrating and for all parties involved. And what
Was it
we
was it like in the handoff to the other firm that was kind of where the challenges were?
yeah, we should have spent more time on schematics because it was a quick, hey, here's just some concept things. I'm sure somebody else will refine it. And the other firm just really made an insane amount of bad assumptions, right? Changed a bunch of stuff, didn't just they weren't geared to this work, and everything kind of went sideways.
Hmm.
And that first project is one of those you kind of like look, hope to plant some more trees. It's not horrible, but like it could be so much better. The builder didn't could have done a better job, and it was like, okay, well, this doesn't work. And what we realized is that handing off doesn't work. We need to do the architecture. We can't do that cost effectively. And so one of the next projects, they wanted us to design a fourplex, but they wanted to build it 4 times. And so we didn't charge that much money because we had to design it once. Kind of gave them the benefit of restamp. And again, a shout out to John Anderson. Like that was one of his ideas: is have a 12plex, and you just keep selling the same thing over and over. And after the light bulb went off, and I was like, oh yes, this is how it works. If we have really thoughtfully well designed buildings that are pre-designed, those are costs the client can afford, and or they can just pay us to modify, tweak something's way more cost effective designing from scratch. And
Yeah.
so working with Lyndhurst and Benwood and Chattanooga Neighborhood Enterprise is the community development corporation that deploys all this housing. Working with them, like we've been able to refine and refine and refine, and we're kind of on like 5th gen right now, I
Huh.
think, honestly. And we were just up last Thursday, and they've got one of this 5th gen things going vertical, and it looks great. We're so excited. Like we've learned, gotten more and more efficient with the detailing and design, but also being more thoughtful about better porches, better trim, putting more money into the project because they are really efficient, right? So it's a bit of a trade-off thing. But also because of all that work, we've got multiple projects in Atlanta going vertical with other nonprofits. And so, we've had to train our nonprofits. We have these great stock buildings. Give us your program, give us your unit mix, give us your site, and let us kind of go through the library, and we can kind of plug and play, somewhere between Tetris and Legos in terms of arranging these really good buildings on simple sites, figure out parking, figure out street
Mm-hmm.
frontage, but the pricing, we had to compete, because one of our nonprofits, I guess they didn't trust our pricing. They want to put it out for bid.
Hmm.
And we were such the low bidder because of the process that they realized that there's not a point to put it out to bid because the quality is better. It's repeatable architecture. It's just thinking about products and services in a completely different fashion. And
Mm-hmm.
I should mention that the vast majority of our clients that we're doing this for are either nonprofits or mission aligned for profit developers.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to be thoughtful with who we're helping. There's a lot of reasons for that, along with really related to getting entitlements to do the work. Uh, but that's the approach, and so that's how we can design and provide great architecture to Memphis, to
Yeah.
Kansas City, to Chattanooga, because we've had to break the model and not think like architects.
So I'm really familiar with that model at the level of single family houses and did that for years. And I actually, like a number of our colleagues, have plans for sale on Allison Ramsey's
Yeah.
website. And, I know how that process works. So what you're talking about is translating that then to the missing middle types, duplexes, fourplexes, bigger, et cetera. What are some of the kind of challenges or encounters? I mean, because one thing that I think about immediately is you start to immediately move into IBC versus
Yeah.
IRC, and I mean, we're kind of get into the weeds here a little bit, but from the standpoint of a professional working through a code process and an entitlement process and a permitting process, how is tricky is that?
Well, let's work back. I mean, we relish super tricky, crazy, complex projects, so it's like breakfast,
Yeah,
But
yeah,
working backwards, the IBC versus IRC is a big deal, and we do IBC stuff all the time, right? So playing in IBC space is a normal situation with all the adaptive reuse and urban infill stuff we do. And the big thing I saw a couple years ago is all these groups are doing pre-approved plans and pattern zones and this and that. And it's really easy, just like Liberty House Plans and Allison Ramsey, to have IRC buildings in there.
yeah.
That's a straightforward animal, and nobody has made sense of IBC. And like, well, there's the lane to be in because this is where some of the housing we desperately need needs to go. And we're a adult firm. We have engineers. We can stamp plans. But what we're doing is not trying to do all this ourselves. Is we're handling this regionally for the Southeast in house, but we're partnering with Allie Quinlan in Fayetteville so she can stamp and get the engineers for, let's say, Oklahoma, Arkansas, for that region. We've got we're partnering with Union Studio, super talented, amazing firm in Providence, on some pre-approved plans for Cape Cod right now with Allie and all of us. And so they've got an amazing IBC library. So we're sharing our libraries and having regional partners. Marcus King and Jim Kuman are up in Minnesota, Michigan. So
Hmm.
we see this as like regional teams. But you get some regional teams, and we've got the core DNA of what we need to do, and partners locally that can pull the engineers into stamp plans. It's That's the approach, in terms of the architecture and licensing and review. And something that was critical for Massachusetts is construction administration is a big deal. You can't. It's just a different approach. You've got to have some regional architect that can lead and oversee, and partner with, right? So that's and through all our relations with CNU and InkDev, like we have most of those relationships, at least for most things east of the Mississippi, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So that's the thought process on that. One of the issues with entitlements is some places are easier than others. Memphis is really doing a lot of great stuff to change things and make it easier to build. Other cities are struggling. But what we found is, I mean, at this point in my life, it's just so exhausting to go battle in a community meeting and try to convince them to do the right thing. So by having nonprofits and mission aligned for profit developers, they're the tip of the spear for community meetings, right? They can go in and talk about attainable housing and all the things communities want, and then we come in and show how to make it beautiful. And it's a super effective pitch, right? That I'm happy to do. And again, to be blunt, in Atlanta, I'm super cognizant that I'm a white guy. right? And there's a lot of places where I'm not the right lead messenger, right? I may
Mm-hmm.
not be the right messenger in any way, shape, or form for some of these communities, but we've got pretty good street cred. And as long as we've got great partners that are diverse and inclusive and trusted by the community, entitlements become less and less of an issue.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. How has that fed back to your understanding of some of the issues or challenges to executing this type of housing in the real world, and maybe where that intersects zoning regulations or building code regulations?
Yeah, building code is not that like kind of fine. What we can come back to, I'll put a pin in that. And zoning, we've been fortunate-ish in Atlanta. We had Tim Keene as a head of
Mm-hmm.
housing and planning from like 15 to 19. And Tim got a lot of great stuff passed before he left for Boise and did great stuff over there, and is back in Charleston doing great stuff there. And got some incremental zoning reforms in that have really helped things happen. One is, there should be no surprise, parking reform, eliminate all parking requirements within a half mile of transit, eliminate parking requirements for existing buildings, allow on-street parking to count for off-street, just great sensible policy that provides the fertile soil for us to do things. But what we also do is we spend a lot of time talking to clients is that like our ability to provide beautiful buildings that need the least amount of subsidy possible, based on your affordability goals, is we need to park it super light. We say that, look, if we can park at this like half a space to 0.6, 0.7 spaces per unit off site, we can do great stuff. And we have that conversation early, which is another reason we pilot with nonprofits, because if they're doing a deeper level of attainability, they also tend to know their constituents that they're looking to house, that they probably at best have 0.5 cars per unit, right? Like, or maybe 0.6.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to convince a nonprofit developer to park light isn't often is not that hard. And if we can't convince them they're not our client, it's okay, right? For-profit guys tend to be more risk averse in that area, and so they want more parking. They get less buildings. They got to charge more rent, right?
Yeah.
It's direct. But we don't have to fight about parking in Atlanta as much, as long as we're in, we call them mobility rich areas, right? And that isn't necessarily transit as much as it is, good sidewalks, on street parking. We have transit and bus lines, and so we care about that stuff that matters, but we try to distill our like neighborhood scanning to work in the mid-sized and smaller towns where it's not like transit or bust. It's, do you have the fabric of block size, community level, that walkability has a fighting chance.
Yeah. Then what about on the zoning side? I mean, you've written a ton about challenges in Atlanta related to zoning, but you also work a lot of other cities. Um, Curious about what, after doing a lot of the work and seeing things get built, like what comes back to you as some of the more critical areas of reform needed.
Yeah, so try not to make this too long story, but Allie and I both were, go with IncDev, you go to a great city, you talk about all these great things to do to provide housing, to make the math work, and all of this stuff is illegal, right? Like it's just
Yeah.
all illegal, and you spin up all of these great young aspiring developers, and it's like, yeah, it's all illegal, guys. It's exactly what you need to do. It's illegal. What are we going to do about it? So we founded a separate company called Ink Codes, which instead of trying to compete with the Opticos and all these other groups, I want to give you this whole blingy code reform. We want to give you incremental code packages. Maybe just a district, maybe just a much better PUD ordinance. But the point of it is, changing your regulations for a whole city is scary. It takes a long time. It's very expensive. It always seems to get watered down, so it's not even
Mm-hmm.
that
Yep.
meaningful. So the cities we work with, we're like, let's educate the leadership, but let's just do a pilot. Let's just do a one-off project to show the community that they can touch and feel. Y'all get to cut a ribbon. Like, and if that's okay, then you can rinse, wash, repeat, and do more of that. And so we've had a lot of success recently. Georgia is leading a pretty interesting program from the state level governor's office. It's called Rural Workforce Housing Infrastructure Development Grants. So if you're going to do workforce housing in rural, which translates to anywhere in Georgia but Savannah or Atlanta from
Mm-hmm.
a policy
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
standpoint, you can tap into these grants and, like, really, really low interest rate construction financing to provide housing. And so we leverage that with municipalities, and we've coming to be convinced that almost every city in America has a 3 acre parcel within 3 to 5 blocks of Main Street that was a school or was a this or was a that. That's a perfect kind of site to pilot, right? So we're helping Dalton, we're helping Brunswick right now. Both these cities have projects going where it's a 3 acre block. Dalton's getting around 40 houses. I think Brunswick's getting about 50 houses.
Hmm.
Some for sale. Brunswick's a mix. But the point is, Dalton needed a whole new PUD. They had nothing that worked. And so we gave them, as part of our services, a district. Here's your new PUD district. Adopt this. Have it on the books. You guys get to control who gets to use it. It's a very low risk political thing. But if this pilot project goes well, you've got a zoning district you can use to repeat. And they've got interest from local developers because it's set up with basic form controls, nothing too heavy. It allows for flexibility of housing types. It's just a usable, flexible zoning that is scary in the wild for politicians, but totally fine constrained. And it's like, let's training wheels this stuff to get people moving. So it's just another way. We fight every day in Atlanta with our head of housing, with our head of zoning. They repeatedly preach that there's no connection between zoning and affordability. We can walk into Dalton and meet with the mayor and heads of every department and multiple council people, have one meeting, do a dog and pony, and the mayor says, get it done. Right. And like, that red carpet is enthralling. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. And so we're like Dalton's, Brunswick's, these, Thomasville's, these cities in Georgia that are amazing places, and across the Southeast. Doesn't just be Georgia. It's that like Georgia has the state resources that really help us deploy the affordability we need. But we're calibrated to the towns of like 20 to 70,000 people to help them increment their policy, to have housing that's good looking and attainable, like just to roadmap the whole have zoning districts they can bake in at a low risk fashion. So we start to just remove the barriers, and every barrier we see, like, okay, how do we lower that barrier? How do we make it easier to get over that threshold?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, big ships are hard to turn. Larger cities are always, their own unique challenge in that regard. One of the things that I remember hearing about, this may be a little bit of a tangent, but for years, I heard people talk about the kind of neighborhood involvement process that the city of Atlanta set up not too long ago. That was they kind of rehashed the way they did neighborhood involvement. They have these like neighborhood councils or something that are combinations of various neighborhoods or something that then have almost a direct role with city government. Am I getting that close to right at all?
Yeah, yeah, much more close than not. So out of the civil rights legislation, I'll get the dates wrong, but I think it was like 74, 75. Atlanta, the federal government mandated that they set up a neighborhood planning unit system, or NPU is their acronym. So we've got, I think it's 25 or 26 NPUs. They're all letters. I think it's 25, but probably 26. And each NPU will catch a range of neighborhoods underneath it. And so when you go through an entitlement process in Atlanta, you start with the neighborhood organization, you work with that local group, and you filter up to the NPU. That's the official vote that gets recognized by the city, and into your board of zoning adjustment or zoning review board, depending on variances or rezonings and stuff like that. So there's a reasonable structure for community engagement. This is they're all volunteer positions, right? Nobody's getting paid doing this stuff. Different NPUs see a much higher level of entitlement work coming through than others. Right. And one of the challenges as Atlanta is continuing to grow and evolve is there's a lot more demand for infill development in Southwest, Northwest, Southwest, and Southeast Atlanta, which are poor and black or blacker. And these are NPUs that have not seen this level of development, and so the volunteers are less experienced. And this gets back to training and community engagement. It's hard. You both have matriarchs and patriarchs of these neighborhoods that may be set in their ways, but have been like there for 30 years, protecting, holding back bad development, and they're trying to pivot or not. It's not a perfect system. There's a massive amount of frustration with it. I think one of the big challenges with any system that's kind of localized or balkanized like this is there's not a lot of benefit to think about citywide issues when it's your local neighborhood.
Sure.
And that's just kind of the core of the issue. So it's the hyper local creates its own set of challenges. So there's a lot of ability for input in the Atlanta system. It just that doesn't mean you're stopping the dumb, but you're not really encouraging the good.
Yeah. Do you feel like that process, maybe compared to other cities you've worked in, becomes more or less NIMByish?
I think one of the challenges in other cities we've seen that have a less formal process is there's more work on, like if it's a bigger project, it's more work on the developer to try to figure out how to meet with everybody,
Yeah, sure.
right? Like here the meetings are scheduled, they're formalized. Ideally, you've got somebody on the other side of the table that's at least used to some of the process, right? And so there's some kind of rules of engagement that may be slightly productive. Whereas in other cities, this is kind of wide open, right? You're trying to gather neighbors, you're putting flyers in mailboxes to try to do an ad hoc meeting, and nobody's really in charge or knows how to think about things. And so there's benefits to the structure. Um, One of the things is, we've been able to walk into meetings with just, great faith partners, great nonprofits, and let them dog and pony and woo the crowd. And then we can have a really easy path to talk about mutual desires and goals and get to yes. And you can just be a regular, for-profit developer and just get destroyed.
Yeah.
Right. So that's, our choice in clients is a direct relation, at least locally, is a direct relation to the environment we work in.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I remember hearing about that in my time in Savannah, and it was just always an interesting thing because Savannah, like Kansas City, like most cities that I've worked in, you have these volunteer neighborhood associations, and um, some of them are fantastic and well organized and thoughtful, and many of them are run by like one or two people who've been running them for 30 years, and
Yep.
there's kind of a different level of engagement, and hard to understand as somebody trying to pitch a project, like who to talk to and what that process is like. So I think Atlanta's kind of setup is unique.
I think that, like, I will say that we've got a ton of neighborhoods in Atlanta that have the exact same situations. A couple people holding it together, working
Yeah.
hard. Um, and so there are NPUs that take on more responsibilities to
Mhm.
kind of cover or make up for weaker underlying organizations. And there's other NPUs that are just kind of a formality,
Yeah.
right? The underlying organizations are super strong. The vote gets passed the NPU. They're just kind of gavel wrapping to just whatever that the kind of home rule-ish kind of thing, whatever the local neighborhood said, that's what it's going to be, kind of move it along. So
Mhm.
there's different responses based on, what part of town, what's happening. And there's also some NPUs where the NPUs are really weak, right? And we've had shenanigans and some NPUs around some projects we were involved in with, I mean, vote manipulation and lying. So it can go completely sideways. Like it's all possible. We're dealing with humans,
Yeah.
right? You just
Right.
kind of so it's not that it's a huge panacea, but I think the whole point is whether you have the NPUs as an intermediary or not, it still comes back to how do you create a structure of what are the city or regional goals, and how does this one neighborhood play into that?
Yeah.
You know, and we've had discussions in the past of like, should there be housing quotas? Like, if kind of like Massachusetts does with their, I think, 40B program, right? At a state to city levels, like if you can't show how you're going to accommodate a certain amount of affordable housing, developers can get zoning exemptions. I think something like that's really critical, but that's not popular, right?
Hmm.
That's not a good way to get elected into local office.
Hmm. Yeah.
So hence not having that.
Right. Well, let's talk some more construction reality. I think I saw something you wrote recently, or it was passed around, that talked about like the sort of the price levels of different types of
Yeah.
construction, and the impact on for anybody trying to provide affordability, and also kind of how things have changed over the last few years. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's my new fascination. So I spent probably too much time on LinkedIn, and while I was over there, saw somebody post something about UCLA housing, the UCLA Housing Voice podcast. And so I was clicking over, started listening to a few episodes. And so they're the format of that podcast is a couple great, hosts really know their stuff, but they're bringing in people that are writing papers, peer reviewed papers and urban economics and other kinds of things. And so it's a little more wonky, a little more academic, but it's a really phenomenal discussion. And so two of the guys on recently is Anthony Orlando and Michael Erickson put together this paper where they ran all the data analysis to look at differentiating the cost per square foot per story for multifamily. And there's a lot of stuff they didn't capture in that. And in the paper and in the podcast, they were super explicit about what they couldn't capture. But it's a pretty sexy like chart because it shows that the most cost-effective way you can build is a three-story walk-up, right? And then it gets 4, 5, 6, 7 stories is also pretty effective cost per square foot. It spikes when you get to high rise at 8 stories, but there's no parking, there's no land cost, there's a lot of things not in this math, right? So, and I'm actually have a call with them today at 4. I want to dig deep. We're trying to brainstorm on how to use the same RS means data to compare single family costs versus multifamily, because that's actually a big concern or a big focus of ours. So we do a ton of IRC single family cottage cluster work to get infill housing more attainably than the multifamily. But then also to look at, when you think about multifamily parking, there's not a lot of sites that you don't park, right?
Right.
And parking costs have a major impact. So you could say that a 7-story building is really sexy from a cost per square foot standpoint, but not if you got to do a 400 car deck.
Yeah.
Right. That, and if and so the parking costs were not captured in there. And I've talked to them, they're really sharp guys, but they're like economists, right? They're not architects. One's married to an architect. So, I volunteered to like, man, I'm happy to throw in and help you brainstorm and like figure out problems. But what I really like about the multifamily comparison is when you think about it related to policy. And what I hear in Atlanta and other places that drives me up the wall is like, everybody's like, let's just upzone our corridors. We'll put all the housing there and we're going to protect the single family. It's going to be fine. And what this chart shows is that that's a much more expensive way to build.
Yeah.
And if you layer in vehicle storage, it's a really expensive way to build. And so if you want attainability, you better show up with a big pot of subsidy if that's your policy.
Yep.
Right. And time and again, we look at small scale IRC infill, on the 50 by 150 lot, 2, 3, 4 units of housing. It's effective to build. It's naturally so much easier to afford to build in that method. And that's just a policy choice. Right. And so if we really care about attainability for our citizens, that's what we need to be looking at. And, we can make that work from an attainable fashion for sale or for rent in challenged neighborhoods in Atlanta, but just regular neighborhoods in Memphis and all these mid-sized cities, KC. That's where building type, cost, and policy all kind of Venn diagram to be increased possibilities. And that chart was like, just for planners who don't do math, big, tall buildings cost more than cottages on a per unit basis every day of the week.
Yeah. Can you give a sense of like the order of magnitude? Is it the difference between construction types there?
Yeah, and I'm gonna I have the chart, so I'll pull up while we talk, so I don't just make stuff up. I've been prone to throw crazy numbers around, and I will try to do this in a more respectful, researched fashion while we're talking. Here's pull the copy up. And one of the things they did, just kind of as a caveat, is they were looking at 2018 data, and they used RS means with a range of things to get this pulled together. And so from 2018, so we're going to go back, they were and they also had to do like a range, right? Like they're not saying it's exactly this price. It varies national averages, kind of a 20 bucks a square foot spread, give or take. But, a 2-story multifamily building, they were saying that's around 138 bucks a square foot, just the building, just vertical, nothing else. 3-story is slightly more cost effective at 135, so just slightly more on average. These are the low end estimates, right? There's a higher end average, it's about 20 bucks a foot more. 4 stories spikes up, because you're changing from a 3-story walk up. 4-story probably get the elevator and other stuff, and that's about 145 a foot. And then eventually they think you really hit a sweet spot at 7 stories, right? Because you're just getting so much building, effectively, and that's almost the same price as a 3-story as you kind of get back down there. But the moment you go to high rise, it spikes dramatically from like 140 bucks a foot to 270, 280 bucks a foot, right? It's actually, let me make sure I'm looking at the wrong number. No, to 185. I'm sorry, I'm looking at that. It's 185 to 190. So like, 20%, 30% jump up in price for high rise. But again, no parking, no land. But what it shows is that their point of this paper was all they were really trying to demonstrate is that there's not a uniformity of construction price based on stories,
Right.
right? And as architects, like we sort of inherently know that, and we inherently know that IRC is cheaper to build than IBC any day of the week, even for the engineering plans.
Right.
But being able to demonstrate that in a way that non-architects, policy people can understand that there's cost implications for these different approaches. It matters, right? These building code thresholds have true limits, ceilings, barriers, implications for how they work. And since most people doing zoning don't understand math or building codes, it's kind of a value neutral space and it's more aspirational from a policy standpoint.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I've seen that I'm sure you've seen as well is then the lack of translation of that understanding of buildings and construction reality to zoning codes,
Yeah.
such that, they may have a zoning district and say like the height limit is 2 stories or it's 5 stories or whatever. It's just not aligned with where the breakdowns are in actual construction technique. So therefore what is likely to actually get built.
Yeah, and that was the podcast covered that, and less my space, but what they were talking about was fascinating. Is that their point was there's a lot of districts that are in downtowns that may have like an 8 or 10 story height cap, and they often see 5, 6, or maybe 7 stories getting built.
Yeah,
and they take that to be a demand response, and it's not. It's that like once you cross 8 stories, that's the most inefficient height to build at. You need to get to 12 or 14 stories because you're already in high rise. You need to recoup scale from going there. And so the point is, from a zoning policy standpoint, do you really care if it's a 10 or 14 story or 18 story cap? You really should be worried about what's going on in the street fronts, right? Like, your public engagement in the public right of way, that's where the action really happens. But their point was a 10 story height cap is probably going to get you 7 story buildings because of these thresholds. And if you're a city that's looking for growth and density, and honestly, a 12 or 15 story building would be acceptable in that location, that's a misalignment of policy.
Yeah.
And what we really hit home for me on this is we totally believe that 3-story walk-ups are the most efficient in terms, because that's the missing middle stuff we're doing all over for nonprofits, but they're super efficient when they're low parked, right? And so I'm trying to figure out some spreadsheet scenarios to brainstorm with them on, like, how do you start rolling in parking costs, whether surface or deck? And we're seeing deck spaces at 35,000, a space. And that's, if you're at a 600 square foot or 500 square foot unit, that's $70-$80 a foot, right? That's almost double, not doubling, but it's like another 40% of cost per square foot if you have a deck space involved. That's a huge determinant, right? Yeah. So, and they weren't, as academics, they weren't trying to any way, shape, or form claim to answer those questions. They're solving one problem, but really igniting an interest in a path of like how much further you could take this without over assuming and kind of going too far with limited data.
Yeah. So another version of that scenario is the thing you wrote about that you called powerplexes, which to me looked like how are you maximizing a site and designing it differently, based on that sort of walk-up construction type. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what you meant by the powerplexes and where you were going with that thinking.
Yeah, and I'm going to build my way up, and I'll pivot to another policy mismatch, and then I'll answer the powerplex question. Another example is like Decatur, Georgia, and a range of other cities that are looking to be progressive have been permitting fourplexes, right, as a type, and they really have their heads around like they want plexes, they want missing middle. And by its nature, that often coded to require IBC buildings, right? So the only way you can provide home ownership is through a condo structure, which is massively litigious, massively inefficient, massively expensive. We've got some nice small format housing that's 4 townhomes like packed together, and it looks like a house, kind of cruciform firewall. And that's not permitted in Decatur. But what we explain is like, if you want to promote home ownership, if you want to promote attainability, you need to let me build 4 small cottages on one lot and sell them individually. If you're trying to limit this to rental or condo, you're creating a huge amount of friction and cost unnecessarily, which is sort of the point of being progressive and not really wanting the stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like that happens in a lot of places, but that's another mismatched policy. If you want 4 units of housing on a site, are 4 detached cottages okay? Or a pair of duplexes okay? because a pair of duplexes is massively more cost effective than a fourplex, right? Just
Yep.
building code, construction, all those things. But one of the things we were showing with the Powerplexes blog post is Atlanta had created a new zoning district specifically to promote missing middle housing. We tried to use it, and neighborhoods quickly realized they did not want this housing, and so the zoning district got demonized. Never speak the name MRMU again. It will never you'll never get an approval. But we were showing that if you wanted to build under this fashion and you want to provide like 2 units of workforce housing, the zoning had a cap of 12 units. You needed to build 10 to 12 units to be able to cross subsidize the rent for a couple units of workforce housing rents. We just ran through the math forward and back. And part of it is that it's way more expensive to build an IBC building, small format with no economies of scale, and provide cross subsidized rents in it. Like you have to build it out in a maximum fashion. And again, when you look back, and I think we wrote that in probably 2018 or 2019 with low interest rates, low construction costs, it was really hard then.
Yeah.
It's near impossible now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd also be remiss if I didn't talk about your experience doing projects yourself and your own development kind of business or endeavors. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about, because you had at least one that I know of pretty well that was kind of a flag lot, an infill flag lot that you developed, 12 units on or something like that?
Oh, so we'll go. I'll start before that one. So I've done two, I think, developments of note. One is La France Walk, and I think there's still a website, you can Google it. And it's a bit of a flag lot, but it's like a 150 by 700 foot lot.
Yeah.
The reason it's a flag is there's a big 1880s home that I live in, developed the neighborhood around it.
Okay.
And so it's 30 units of housing on 2.5 acres. And one of the things that happens is, when you hang out with the cool kids, in Ink Dev, you can't just build bigger homes with 2-car garages next to a heavy rail station. Like you're going to get laughed at, right? And you should, right? That's not appropriate. So I had some previous entitlements that, this is a rapidly transitioning neighborhood, trying to figure out what's the right kind of product for the market. And I was also building it in phases. And so in the first phase, I had 4 homes. One was probably 2,000 square feet, and the other 3 were like around 2,500, 2,800 square feet. And the bigger ones had 2-car garages, which I knew was just like my street cred would be just ruined if this is what actually got built. And we had gone in, we're helping Chattanooga with an initial toolkit for Ink Dev, and Eric Brown was there helping with some ideas, and he had a shop house, I think is what he called it, where it's a kind of a standard traditional home with a small commercial thing tacked on the side. And I saw that. I was like, well, I've got a regular home with a garage tacked on the side. I should take out one of those garage spaces and, just copy what Eric did and put in a little micro suite, a little room with a toilet and a shower, and then there's cabinetry with a sink outside of it. And it is like a micro hotel suite, but it's Airbnb ready. It's home office ready. It's attached to the house, often not linked internally. And of the first 4 buyers, one family bought in because they knew they could Airbnb and that would totally help them make the payments. Another family bought because they had visiting parents that couldn't do stairs, and so that was a grandparent suite for visiting grandkids. Another was a single professional surgeon. She had a family friend who had a friend who's going through nursing school, lived there for 4 years, kind of share the house, have her own place. And so we needed a name. We call them guest suites, right? Like there's no stove, like junior ADU, like there's all kinds of terms, but allowing people to be landlords of the smallest increments is super powerful. That's an Ink Dev thing. And this gave people a chance to do it. And, the second phase, they all had them in it. And you had one couple bought because they knew they could have the rental income, that would help them afford the house. They just qualified for the loan kind of on the top end of their income, but they were very house rich because they were making $1,200 to $1,500 a month off of Airbnb, not working that hard. We had another couple moved from Chicago with an aging mom in tow, and she got to live the last 3 years of her life, like with her son and his partner, and not be in a home, right? Like, because she had that suite there to live in. And so as I was watching folks live in these places long term, I was like, well, like, would somebody be willing to pay a little bit less in rent if they didn't have a stove? They got, the whole wet bar, the things we talk about in Ink Dev. what are the trade-offs? And so I was able to build and hold some of the units at the back end of La France Walk as full rentals, nice two and a half, like really nice units, regular units. But I have a series of studios in the basement that are, small 400 square foot studios, full wet bar, no stove, and they rent for like 1150, 1200 bucks a month.
Wow.
And in Atlanta, right by a train station in a really nice, mini New Urbanist pocket neighborhood, that's pretty good housing prices.
Yeah. Yeah.
The key though is you're not allowed to have a car on site. Like I don't have parking for you. Plenty of on-street parking, but if you're willing to park a car in the street or not have a car, are you willing to pay 1200 bucks a month, right? And so it's sort of this social experiment, a test of what are people willing to pay for or not. And some are, some definitely aren't. But the second development I did was Finley Street Cottages, where did a buy right development with we were allowed to do a duplex, which means attached firewall, 2 units. We have ADUs that we're allowed to do, but we're also allowed to do guest houses, which is where the idea came from. We've had this really bizarre, pretty racist legacy accessory dwelling type in Atlanta, where it's been on the books forever, and it's only for short-term occupancy, except for your servants and watchmen. Still in the code, still here, 2024. And I built some guest houses, and I have employment contracts for watch people to live there. And they don't have a stove, but they have an amazing wet bar. They have microwave, dishwasher, sink, full. It's all full size kitchen, just no stove.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful gas grill with a big, covered canopy thing in the middle of the cottage court, so you could go cook a steak and hang out with your neighbors, and they do, right? Um, and so part of it is, we've got these acute 1 bedroom homes that are like 560 square feet that are guest houses. And so for 1,600 bucks a month, would you like to have your own house? And if you want to cook a steak, you'll go hang out with your neighbors and cook a steak outdoors. Is that something you're willing to do? The catch is there's only on-street parking,
Yeah.
right? So, and the community's been really gelling well over the past 2 years. Folks realize like it's special. They know their neighbors. Like there's a family with kids that play Legos, in the grass. Like it's just like it's pretty awesome. And it's also not for everybody.
Yeah, sure.
But like if you want to live in a nice place that's walkable and connected and know your neighbors, like this is a very wonderful alternative.
Yeah. Well, like nothing is for everybody, right? Having
Yeah.
a 10-bedroom house isn't for everybody. So
Yeah.
it's to each his own.
Yeah.
So I also want to talk a little bit about your endeavor with your partner to do the Atlanta ADU company. Because I remember when you all started this, and I thought it was really, really interesting. And I'm dying to see how this effort goes, because I think there's applicability to cities all over the country, and for other architects, frankly, who want to get into this world. But talk a little bit about that business venture and what's going on with it today.
Sure. So Atlanta ADU Co. Started with my former business partner several years ago, and saw the housing need, kind of Inc. Dev training related, and saw how hard it was to build an ADU in Atlanta. Like very tough permit process. You just saw barrier after barrier, and like we had slides that if you want to be a homeowner and you want to get an ADU, you got to learn to be a project manager. You got to learn to be a permit expert. You got to hire an architect. You got to hire a contractor. You have to figure out all the financing. It's just barrier after barrier after barrier, and this isn't really necessarily Atlanta specific. All these forms and fashions come into trying to like build a house behind your house anywhere in America. It's hard. And so our goal was, well, we know how to do permits. We know how the plans work. We'll have stock plans. We'll have construction partners so we can get some construction pricing certainty. And this is also done in 2017, 2018, before COVID, crazy price spikes. But the goal was to provide a lot of certainty in the process for people, and that they could, hire us to get the thing done, if you will. And it was successful. It was good. Part of the fundamental challenge, though, is that financing of ADUs is really hard. And I know there's some better loan products with Fannie and Freddie out there now where you can count ahead of time future income, which is a great thing. But most of the time, you're stuck with trying to like have a home equity line of credit or just having cash, and it's $150,000 to $200,000, to build a decent ADU. That's you're really exclusive right out of the gates.
Yeah.
And my goal for the company wasn't just to be doing ADUs, is hopefully like get it up, get it rolling, but like have those plans to be able to do like a 10 unit cottage court or a 12 unit. And so it's probably 2018, 2019, separated from my business partner in that and the architecture firm. He took ADU Co. I took the architecture firm, and they're still making progress. I think financing is still the fundamental barrier. But it speaks to cities that are trying to pre-approve plans. Like that's great, but it's still one barrier, right?
Hmm.
If you still need erosion plans and foundation details, and you still need a contractor, like it's still hard for homeowners to do this. And we're super proponents of ADUs, but we're also very sensitive to how hard they are. And so one of my big passions when we talk about policy is I call them fee simple ADUs, right? Who builds houses? Builders. Builders build houses. Most builders build houses to sell. If you want more ADUs to get built, make it financially viable for builders to build ADUs. We're seeing in Atlanta and some of our, let's say, Tony or historic districts, builders have figured out that instead of building a 3,500 square foot house, it's more valuable to build a 2,600 square foot house and a 700 square foot ADU. Like that's more desirable for some buyers.
Hmm.
But what would really turbocharge it is you can sell the ADU separately from the house, right? Just let the builder build and sell, because any builder that can build two houses instead of one, you're really going to get their attention, right? And that's how financing is simplified. You're streamlining, financial products to housing types. There's all kinds of cute ways to cluster with two lots to get like a little four court community. You're reducing McMansions because ADUs reduce the buildable square footage for the front house. But that's an example of you need to align policy with finance and construction. And I think fee simple ADUs are critical. In Durham, they're expanding housing choice policies is another way to say what I just said. They
Hmm.
allow flag lots to be sold fee simple. You can do more than just fee simple and ADU, but it allows you to sell off the back half of your lot, which I think is a huge deal if we want to get more housing deployed.
Yeah, either approach there has some trade-offs.
Yep.
It seems like so. I can imagine allowing back half of the lot to be sold off, especially like in my city where most of our neighborhoods don't have alleys. There's all sorts of issues that come up with city departments, with fire, with addressing, with all sorts utility, any number of utilities. Um, so that's not like a universal solution, but there are a lot of locations, especially if you do have access to an alley, where that could be a phenomenal solution.
I would argue that all those things you just listed as typical problems are all solvable if the city's committed,
Yeah,
right? Like if you're allowed to build a house behind a house because it's an ADU, there shouldn't be a fire issue,
yeah,
whether it's owned or rented, right?
yeah,
Like that's an artificial constraint by the fire department. Addressing, you should be able to have an address for both units, right?
yeah,
Like in utilities, you can easement or you can flag,
yeah,
right? Like all these things are solvable. It's just a question of does what we see time and again is if you let each department stay in their silo, it's just roadblock after roadblock.
right.
It takes a mayor or a city manager or somebody in a leadership position to say, y'all figure this out, get it done, we're going to do it. And it's amazing how fast all those roadblocks just kind of melt away.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt, no doubt. How have you seen? This is just kind of one little more technical thing, addressing water sewer connections when you're trying to retrofit, like putting an ADU on an existing lot behind a
Sure.
house.
Yeah. So the typical thing we've seen in Atlanta, we have a lot of topography. And so assuming gravity, you're not fighting gravity, what we see the most cost effective solution is you run your sewer line from the ADU to the main house. And odds are you probably can't gravity connect, but you can do like a little pump lift station in the crawl that ties you into the main house. And it's just a lot cheaper than running, another 70, 80 feet of
Oh
sewer
God,
line in the
yeah,
side yard, a
yeah,
separate tap.
yeah,
Sometimes maybe it's worth it. Redoing a driveway and you just want to do a Y in the front yard, but tying into the existing house sewer with a little pump is like 8 out of 10 times kind of the most
yeah.
cost effective thing to do.
Yeah, but I think it kind of
How?
speaks to your larger point that these things are not easy or
Yeah.
cheap,
Nope.
and it's going to be a certain profile of homeowner who's going to be able to have the basically the money to be able to afford to build them.
But also if you let a builder build and sell and they're going to scrape the lot, or if they have a pair of
Right.
lots and scrape, it's so much simpler,
Yeah, yeah, I can
so
see
much more
that.
cost effective, and you're getting the housing you want. Like so
Yeah,
that's where how do we build housing? We professionalize it to builders. They've got the subs, they've got the trades, do it all at
yeah,
once, way more effective. And it's not that it's either or, right? Just saying like we need to allow all of these things to happen. We
Right.
just don't make it easy for builders. There's very little financial incentive for builders to even think about this stuff, and we
Yeah,
need to
no
change
doubt.
the financial incentives.
Yeah. I know one diagram that you did that I saw where you showed basically 3 or 4 units on what might be a typical single family
Yep.
property with kind of creative use of, guest cottages or ADUs in the back. Is that actually an option in Atlanta's current zoning?
It is. It's also we were helping a nonprofit, and they got their tails handed to them due to neighborhood politics. But what they were able to show is in Atlanta on a standard single family lot, not all lots, but like our most common is R4, but like regular lot, you're allowed to have a primary house. You're allowed to have an ADU, which is up to 750 square feet, and you're allowed to have a guest house, which is no stove, watch person, servant. That is, 30% of the main house. But we also were doing a single guest suite on the main house. So we were getting 4 units of housing on a lot. Now, we weren't parking this. And what's amazing, this nonprofit they were working with was able to do 50% of AMI mixed income, right? Like the guest suite would be a 2 bed at like $600 or $700 a month.
Hmm.
Like they got a limited grant from the development authority for like $1 million to do like 20 units
Hmm.
like not, they didn't get a lot of local subsidy, but they were delivering 40% of AMI,
Wow.
right? Right. No LITEC, no federal compliance. And they got blasted because they were originally doing home ownership and they pivoted to rental because they realized the neighbors they were trying to stabilize and help would never qualify to buy a house. And one house per lot was a highly ineffective way to do it. They thought they'd be, kick a button, taking names, and they just did a second unit with an ADU, and we showed them how to get 4. And the math was transformational.
Yeah.
And the result of changing the system was a political disaster for them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's wild. I mean, there's so much about that that's just speaks to kind of problems with the way we approach things today, and not just political issues, but the reality of design and construction that we kind of talked about all along. And here's the scale at which those things actually, the numbers made sense.
Yeah, like I mean, literally directly IRC, 3 to 4 units per lot, small format, low parked,
Yeah.
50% of AMI of Atlanta. But like that's our AMI at the time was high, low, mid 60s, high
Mm.
50s, like 58, I think. So like somebody making 35, $38,000 a year that needs a $700, new construction place to live. Like this is how you do it.
Yeah.
And like again, rapidly transitioning neighborhood that want to promote home ownership, which was, a property price increase scheme, gentrification scheme. That was what they chose to prioritize.
Interesting. Well, Eric, it's been about an hour. I think we should probably wrap here. I know we
Yep.
covered a lot of ground and there's more to cover. If people are trying to find you or your company, what's the best place to go?
So our website is kronbergua.com for Kronberg Urban Architects, KRONBERGUA.com. And I'll give a shout out. We put almost every presentation we do on our website, free
Mm-hmm.
viewing. So there's tons of stuff there people can peruse. We've got a couple books, couple toolkits for sale there. We make like $1. It's print on demand, but there's great information for folks if you need analog. And then I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. It's an easy place to find me and connect. I'm trying to share as much as I can there to continue to evangelize and spread the message. So those are the best spots to find us.
Oh, that's fantastic. Hey, I really appreciate doing this. This is terrific. It's great to connect. Again, you get when you get down to Savannah ever? Or
We do. We're helping Brunswick, and we're working on a new project in Darien, which is just a little
oh,
bit
cool.
further south.
Yeah, sure.
And we've got friends in Savannah trying to get some cottage stuff going. So we love the coast, and Savannah is
Yeah,
just such an amazing city. So like, it doesn't take much of an excuse for me to get down there.
yeah, no doubt, no doubt. All right, man. Great to talk to you. Thanks so much. Check out Eric's work and his firm's work. I really suggest looking at their blog and their graphic and presentation work. It's first rate. So take care, man.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin.